Everyone, welcome back to Apollo Art Analysis. This episode, we're going to be checking out a piece by the established AI generative artist known as KLA. This episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Dreamcore aesthetic, we're going to talk about nostalgia, and we're also going to talk about the Midjourney AI art program. So let's jump right into it. So whenever you first see this work, you met with a pretty unique perspective here. We appear to be standing within this singular room, kind of staring at this ball pit with these kind of ionic or Tuscan pillars there. Really interesting. Quite a colorful first impression, right? We have this kind of pastel pink, this pastel blue, not very diverse color, but we certainly have a lot of different values of light, so that does introduce a bit of diversity to the color composition. So in the realm of the setting, it is quite interesting, right? We appear to be in this very small room. We can't see behind us, of course. This appears to end here. There doesn't seem to be too much behind this. Quite interesting, right? A little bit unsettling, but it certainly catches the eye, right? We do get a slight sense of luxury as well, of course. If you're going to make columns like this, it's going to take a little bit of resources to be able to make that happen. So there is a slight bit of luxury, and we're actually going to talk about that in here a second with the prompt, but it's really interesting. We have this unique sense of texture as well, right? Most of it feels quite delicate and quite smooth. Of course, you look on the wall, it almost looks like plaster or stone in a way. And then we look down here, we get a little bit of texture here. It appears to be some type of stone, a little bit more texture, more rough there compared to, say, the smooth walls. Certainly catches the eye, and we do have a pastel color palette, so that does make it feel a little bit delicate, a little bit light as well. Really interesting to note. And so, like I said, in the realm of color, you have this kind of purple, blue, a little bit of green, pink as well. Really interesting to note that, and they are pretty much analogous, so they are going to work together quite well. And like I said, we have that pastel color palette as well. It's going to feel very delicate, feel very light and kind of wispy in that way as well. It's kind of hard to exactly explain why, but the pastels always convey that sense there. So it does feel a little surreal here, right? We see the AI's interpretation of a half pillar here. We don't see any type of room behind here. We're kind of staring at a corner in a way we don't see behind us. So this feels surreal in a way. It doesn't feel exactly real. It's kind of edging on the border of surreal and real. So I think that's interesting to note. I think that also harps back to what we would call the Dreamcore aesthetic, or the dream in general. And of course, dreams are very strange by nature, right? You're going to have walls moving, settings change, people. Sometimes you can't talk in dreams. So many different things you could point to. But we've see that sense of surrealism within the work at hand as well. I think that also points to what we would call the Dreamcore aesthetic. And the Dreamcore aesthetic, there's a lot of different ways you could tackle that. Some people include liminal spaces within that. Some people include trauma core and things like that within that as well. But the Dreamcore aesthetic really harps back to a sense of nostalgia or a sense of longing for the past. And we've seen that a lot more specifically around 90s and 2000s kids. So if you were a kid in the 90s or the 2000s, there is a high possibility that Dreamcore art is going to appeal to you in some way or another. Of course, abandoned malls, kind of old, early 2000s, late 90s aesthetics. We kind of see that here, right? Ball pits are really only reserved for kids, but the artist here is kind of working with that sense of nostalgia, kind of that early childhood theme as well. I think that's really interesting here. So whenever you look at this work, if you invoke a sense of nostalgia, you're probably going to point to this ball pit here. And the artist actually said that this is really for adults. So it's not for a kid. It's meant to kind of incorporate that sense of nostalgia in an adult context as well. I think that's really interesting. It captures that kind of ascendant awe and wonder that we feel in our early childhood. Of course, as a kid, everything feels new. Everything feels novel. So, things like this certainly catch our eye and kind of leave that lasting impression on our memory. I think that's all really important when we're looking at this work. So the artist really notes that sense of nostalgia. I think that's incredibly important. And, as kids, we just have that pure imagination. So we see kind of that pastel, Dreamcore aesthetic, maybe harping back on some of those memories here for sure. And so with this in mind, the artist in some of the early works, for example, Aquatech, which we just talked about, the artist was talking about, not specific, the piece wasn't specifically centered around that, but the artist did note the 90s as a sense of nostalgia. So we certainly see that here, the artist is much more direct on the sense of nostalgia in the theme of this work compared to Aquatech. But all in all, we certainly love that 90s aesthetic, that kind of nostalgia that we get from, and I think the artist conveys that quite masterfully. And so, you have that absolute awe, that early novelty, always going to leave a lasting impression. And so incredibly important. Of course, the Vaporwave aesthetic also captures a bit of that. This doesn't necessarily feel Vaporwave in a concrete kind of context, but we certainly could harp back to, say, the neon color palette and incorporate that alongside, say, the pillars here, we certainly see a bit of revitalization of the Greek aesthetic and neon colors as well. It kind of mixes in that Vaporwave aesthetic, so we could point to a little bit of that here. So really interesting. Like I said, this is an AI generative artwork, so you kind of put a prompt into the AI art program, whatever that be, and you kind of get the wish that you hope for, or at least hopefully, right? So I have the original prompt here. This was actually created in the Midjourney AI art program. Let's move this down just a little bit. So this is the prompt that was put into the Midjourney AI art program. And this is the result that we get here. So we're gonna look at that real quick. So quote, a ball pit inside of an ancient Roman bathhouse, a ball pit, pastel mint pink and orange, balanced and symmetrical, cinematic pastel lighting, fuzzy Cinestel 800T. I really think this is incredibly important to understanding this work. First off, if you look at this, you're probably not gonna, at least me personally, I didn't guess that it was a Roman bathhouse, but looking at the prompt, it just makes so much sense, right? You have this pit, of course, which would be the bath, but we have, of course, the ball pit. Then you have a bit of pillars here as well. Really interesting. But aside from that, of course, that pastel mint pink, not quite pink, but a mint pink, we kind of see that in this area. Aside from that, balance and symmetrical, we see that sense of balance as well. Pastel lighting and fuzzy, I think that's also really important. The sense of kind of the fuzzy, I think that really gives that dreamcore aesthetic here. There is a bit of haze. It feels a little bit surreal in that nature. So the original artist, KLA, does an amazing job with these prompts and really gotta reference that in order to really understand the work before us. And to hopefully aid us in understanding this work a bit more, I have two AI generative artworks from the artist Marco Liminal. If y'all want to reference that, I'll put it in the description real quick. But what I want y'all to look at is a sense of nostalgia or the dreamcore, but more importantly, in the aesthetic of a kind of AI generative medium. So I think that's really interesting. So in the center here, the artist, of course, is working with that sense of nostalgia, working with that kind of dreamcore aesthetic in a way with that hazy effect. Really interesting here, of course, created in Midjourney as well. If I had to guess, I would say the pieces on the right or left are also Midjourney. I'm not entirely sure on that front, but we certainly see a sense of nostalgia, of course, compared to the original work that we looked at today. So, for example, on the right, you have an incredible use of color. Certainly feels nostalgic, kind of that early childhood aesthetic of the 2000s, maybe late 90s there. And then on here, of course, you have all these balloons. It's kind of reminded me of these ball pits here. Of course, you have all of those kind of spherical type of forms, but it does give a sense of nostalgia. Balloons, just like the ball pit, feel very kind of childhood-esque in that theme. So really wanted to point these to y'all and kind of point that out, see if y'all could reference this a bit deeper. But yeah, I hope y'all enjoyed today. We talked about a bunch of different things. Talked about these kind of Tuscan ionic pillars, not exactly sure. We talked about a sense of nostalgia. We talked about, the Midjourney AI generative art program. So many different things really covered today. We talked about nostalgia of the early childhood, a little bit of the dreamcore aesthetic as well. So many different things we hit on. If y'all enjoyed today, go check out the original artist KLA. Like I said, always doing some really good stuff in that AI generative medium. My name is Apollo. This was Apollo Art Analysis, and I'll see y'all on the next episode. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to support our work directly, please check out our Apollo community tokens. Apollo Art Exchange is an ecosystem of art appreciation which elevates artists each and every day. Thanks for listening.